Hello, everyone, and welcome to Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I'm your host, Anthony Flint. Well, the housing affordability crisis, we think it's safe to call it that, just keeps rolling on, and it's dragging down otherwise booming local economies. A survey for the Boston Chamber of Commerce found that nearly one-third of young people say they plan to leave because of high home prices. The Massachusetts housing chief bemoaned, "That's our workforce. That's your favorite restaurant that can't find enough help to stay open," he wrote in the Boston Globe. "That's the child care provider you drop your kids off with. That's the large company considering moving out of state. That's our economy." And it's not just home buyers. According to the Joint Center for Housing Studies, the number of cost-burdened renters hit a record high, with half of all households spending more than 30% of their income on rent and utilities. And it's not just the young. The U.S. population of people over 65 is ballooning past 60 million. Most of those folks will be on fixed incomes while managing rising healthcare costs. The Lincoln Institute is well attuned to this extraordinary challenge and recently dedicated our annual Journalist Forum to the subject of affordable housing. It was a lively series of conversations over 2 days. We had some 30 reporters, editors, podcasters, and Substack columnists who sized up the problem and assessed the impact of several current policy interventions. We thought it was well worth sharing some highlights here on Land Matters. The 2023 Journalist Forum, Innovations in Affordability, was made possible by a partnership with the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University and TD Bank. The annual convening bridges the media and academic inquiry, allowing journalists to hear new ideas and network with each other. We organized the workshop by first looking at the scope of the crisis and then examining 4 major interventions. Statewide zoning mandates forcing cities and towns to allow more multifamily development, using tax policy to help manage runaway land prices and real estate speculation, with Detroit's efforts to establish a land tax as a case study, local strategies to outmaneuver institutional investors, and potential changes in the home financing system to help close a stubborn racial wealth gap. We began the proceedings with Arthur Jamison, director of the Boston Planning and Development Agency, who spoke of an all-of-the-above approach to increasing housing supply, including legalizing accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, a citywide rezoning initiative known as Squares and Streets, and the offer of big incentives to property owners who convert vacant office buildings to residential. Cities like Boston are going to need all that and more. According to the State of the Nation's Housing Report issued annually by the Joint Center, home construction hasn't kept pace with demand ever since the Great Recession.
Prices are still going up because there's so few houses there to buy.
That's Daniel McHugh, Senior Research Associate at the Joint Center, who said prices are up 40% nationwide, inventory is tight, and it appears the era of low interest rates is over.
The ability to buy more house with lower interest rates, 30 years of that. All of a sudden it's gone. And look at what happens in that middle of housing mortgage costs, just through the roof, right? That's the carpet getting pulled out from under you if you're a millennial, maybe even a Gen Zer, like saying, oh, I was going to just buy a house, but now how am I going to do that?
So how can communities encourage the construction of more housing and different types of housing? Well, one popular idea is the first policy intervention up for examination, and really the major story in affordable housing for at least the past year, and that's statewide zoning reform. From California to Connecticut, states are pushing cities and towns to allow more multifamily housing and greater density, especially oriented around transit, and local jurisdictions have been pushing back. Jesse Grogan, Associate Director of Reduced Poverty and Spatial Inequality at the Lincoln Institute, helped explain what's been going on.
Fundamentally, what we have is a problem of geographical mismatch. The housing market, in many cases, it's a regional problem, if not in places like California, even at a higher geographic scale. But most of the tools that we're given to address that problem are at a local level. So we've created this system of perverse incentives, particularly for the more affluent, higher opportunity places, where current residents, even if they acknowledge the need for more affordable housing and more housing supply more broadly at a regional level, it's really in their best interest to keep the gates up and keep the housing supply low in their places. If housing supply is low, property values remain high, their places can provide a higher level of services with a lower property tax rate. It's great for them, it's terrible for the region. This challenge it's not a question of how do we produce more housing units in these places, it's how do we get the political will. It's a politics problem, not a policy problem. And it's not a problem that seems to be particularly easily overcome. Advocates have been working for decades on trying to convince high opportunity places to build more housing with very little success. So this is where the state level comes in. We start to think about how we can change the level of the intervention to match the level of the problem. In general, the things that these state policies tend to do are one of three things. First, they try to boost overall housing supply. Second, they try to increase the amount of inexpensive and below market rate housing. And third, they try to build housing in strategic places like near transit.
Jenny Schutz from the Brookings Institution, who co-authored a Lincoln Institute policy download on implementing state housing reform, said it will take a while before anyone can measure the impact of such interventions, and even longer for new housing to materialize. Developers need to wait for their municipality to write and pass new state-compliant zoning rules before they can apply for permits. Some communities, like those in Massachusetts, who have pushed back on the state's MBTA Communities Act, have put up a fight.
The depressing thing for people who want to monitor sort of outcomes of these laws, we would like to think, oh, the state now legalized a bunch of new housing, you can build apartments near transit stations, how many apartments are getting built? And of course the answer is, well, so far none, because we don't actually have local zoning in place, right? So it's going to take a couple of years before we start seeing even sort of the early stages, like developers requesting permits for these apartments in the new zones around transit in Massachusetts. There's been a variation in how local governments respond. We pay a lot of attention to the super NIMBY affluent places that basically tell the state, yeah, I'm not even going to pretend to comply with this, and I might in fact sue you and say that you don't have the authority to require me to do this. So there's some lawsuits back and forth in both directions. But there are also a bunch of places that said, you know what, we need to build some more housing, and this sounds reasonable, and you're in some sense giving cover to local elected officials, right? So a forward-looking mayor or city council can go to their voters and say, hey, the state is telling us we have to allow apartments, we have to allow duplexes. We know, in fact, that we have an affordability problem, that many of the kids who grew up here can't move back to the community because it's so expensive. So we're going to take this opportunity and lean into the idea and figure out on our terms what works for us to comply with the state mandate, but also to actually generate more housing that we know some of our current residents need and would approve.
But does increasing density in housing supply at the local level actually have a downward impact on prices? Patrick Condon of the University of British Columbia was the contrarian, using Vancouver as the case study. There are lots of good reasons for zoning reform and increasing density, he said, but sadly, affordability is not one of them.
There is no other center city that I've been able to find in North America that's come even remotely close to the addition of new supply. And lo and behold, unfortunately, if adding supply was going to reduce prices, Vancouver should have the cheapest housing in North America. It now has the most expensive housing in North America. The question is why? Why didn't that additional supply help? And the answer seems to be that land prices absorbed all that benefit of that new supply. When we added supply, what happened was, because the capacity of those parcels was increased in terms of the financial return on it, it's reflected in this tremendous rise in land value, not rise in building value, but rise in land value.
Condon pointed to Cambridge, Massachusetts, as one community taking the right approach. Its 100% affordable housing overlay allows extra density in exchange for assured permanent affordability.
The wrong thing is just to increase allowable density and think that that's going to solve the problem. The right thing is to figure out ways to capture that new land value increase in the context of rebuilding these neighborhoods. Municipalities need to have the power and should discipline the land market. And a lot of the initiatives that we're talking about today do the opposite. they unleash the land market. So it's a fundamentally different philosophy of how to solve the problem. My own view, after my own experience and working on this topic, is that unleashing the land market through opening up, new authorities to do with your land whatever you want, or more than what you can presently do. Again, if your objective is affordability, and you think that the cornucopia of the free market is going to deliver housing at affordable prices now, is a misdiagnosis of the problem.
For now, metropolitan regions are collecting data and hoping for the best. The impacts of increased housing supply can be subtle. In Minneapolis, where the city legalized triplexes on all residential lots and did away with parking requirements, rents went up just 1% compared to 31% nationally, according to Pew Research. In California, where there have been dozens of new statewide housing measures like preempting local zoning to allow ADUs by right on nearly all residential lots, there's a little bit more evidence to analyze. But prices and rents remain stubbornly high, says David Garcia, director of the Turner Center for Housing Innovation at the University of California, Berkeley.
The bottom line, the question is it working? So my very simple answer to that question is not yet, but maybe. There are a couple ways that we like to think about this. I go first and foremost to the extent that these laws are supposed to facilitate the construction of more housing, the increase of supply. We're actually not seeing that happen, not at the levels that they need to keep up with existing demand per what the state estimates we need to be building.
Well, how can tax policy help? That was the next intervention to come up for examination, with the spotlight on a proposal by the city of Detroit to institute a land tax, shifting from assessing the value of land versus the value of buildings to curb speculation and encourage development. About 17% of Detroit's 138 square miles are vacant, said Chief Financial Officer Jay Rising, and owners of unproductive land pay very little in property taxes. Some owners are just sitting on that land, waiting for the value to go up as the city revitalizes. Taxing land more than buildings is aimed at lowering the property tax burden for all the homeowners who have stayed in Detroit through all the hard times and seek to raise their families there. Nick Allen from MIT, who co-authored a Lincoln Institute study on the feasibility of splitting the tax rates for land and buildings, and Lincoln Institute senior fellow Joan Youngman helped explain. First year's Nick Allen, followed by Joan Youngman.
A land value tax, in some ways, is just a neutral tax. It's what some economists have called the least bad tax. It taxes an asset that doesn't move, that when you tax it, it doesn't chase that asset away.
In a number of ways, the lessons of Detroit in seeing the potential of a land tax have implications for property taxes everywhere. The property tax has a land tax component. That's not all. It also has a building tax component. But we tax many things in addition to land. We tax income, we tax sales, we tax transfers, we tax estates, and we tax buildings. But we have a land value tax. And as Jay and Nick have said, a land tax has special efficiency and equity benefits. It does not discourage production, and it reaches the bare land value represents really a social good. If you have a piece of bare land in the middle of Manhattan, you have wealth, but not because of anything you did. It's because society has grown and there's demand around you. And so that particular form of wealth is actually appropriate for thinking about things like value capture initiatives. If public services or public investment raise land values, the land value is an appropriate revenue source to help fund those public activities. So that's why we think the property tax, the standard property tax, even without a change to land value tax or different rates, is very much worth supporting and defending and encouraging to keep values up to date.
The discussion then turned to the third intervention, battling institutional investors, those large companies that are buying, flipping, or charging high rents for properties in weak and up-and-coming real estate markets. Cincinnati Mayor Aftab Pureval, appearing on video, touted the use of a Port of Cincinnati bond issue to outbid institutional investors for control of nearly 200 properties across several neighborhoods.
We have an aging built environment, aging buildings and aging single-family homes. And that reality, combined with the fact that we're an affordable city in the national context, has made us a key target for predatory institutional investors. Like other cities, we've seen a trend of bad acting out-of-town corporations coming in to buy up huge swaths of single-family homes, not doing anything to invest in them, and then jacking up the rents overnight. This practice contributes to pricing legacy communities out of their neighborhoods. It hurts the well-being of the tenants who are being neglected, and it has a negative impact on our entire housing market. And our partners jumped at the chance to get these houses back into the hands of local homeowners. Since taking control of these homes, the Port has made tremendous progress on two goals. First, supporting existing tenants with the property maintenance and outreach they've been lacking. Since 2022, 70 tenants have received rental assistance, and maintenance requests went from there being no clear process in place under the former owner to an average completion of requests of 72 hours. And two, the second goal, the reason there's so much potential in this program has been to rehab these homes and put them back into the market for families, not for institutional investors to buy.
The success in Cincinnati was the result of a thoughtful organization of public finance structures that can be replicated in other communities to preserve affordable housing, according to R.J. McGrail, who leads the Accelerating Community Investment Initiative at the Lincoln Institute. The extent of property ownership by institutional investors, covered by many news outlets as a key facet of the housing affordability crisis, is now being documented using an increasingly sophisticated mapping technology. Jeff Allenby, Director of Innovation at the Center for Geospatial Solutions, shared the center's Who Owns America methodology. In one neighborhood in Baltimore, for example, ownership by institutional investors appears as a giant swath, with some blocks fully occupied, house by house. David Howard, chief executive of the National Rental Home Council, a D.C.-based nonprofit trade association that represents the single-family rental home industry, countered that property ownership by institutional investors is a small fraction on a national basis, though he acknowledged it's more concentrated in certain metro areas. While there are some bad actors, he said, outside investors are simply meeting market demand, fueled by a slowdown in construction of starter homes. Finally, we looked at the all-important subject of home financing. After the Community Reinvestment Act and the financial crisis of 2008, a reset has been in the works for both individuals and neighborhoods to access capital to help close the racial homeownership gap. But there's disagreement on how much can be accomplished with policy tweaks versus a more radical reassessment of the $12 trillion mortgage market. The moderator of this session, NPR reporter Chris Arnold, opened the discussion by noting that if zoning reform and other measures increase housing supply, as the ice flow breaks up, as he put it, barriers remain for financing home ownership, particularly for low-income families and communities of color. Some incremental measures to allow more people to enjoy wealth building through home ownership include down payment assistance, making the application process easier, improving the credit score and appraisal process, special purpose credit programs, and making it possible to get financing for ADUs, manufactured homes, and property purchases in community land trusts. Will incremental measures be sufficient? Not really, in the view of Crystal Corngay, director of Mass Housing, an independent quasi-public agency created in 1966 and charged with providing financing for affordable housing in Massachusetts.
We think about the housing finance system as a creation of the market. And in fact, it's not. It's a creation of government. The question is really much more about what can the government do to create a system that's equal for everybody. Because they created this system that's unequal, they can also create a different system. Money is really expensive. And so I argue that that's government's role. I just want to write people checks. You get a house, you get a house, you get a house. And we did that with a program that we had that we call Mass Dreams. We had money from the federal government as a result of the pandemic. They gave us money. And so we said, let's make a program in which we basically wrote people checks up to $50,000 so you could buy a house. You had to live in a disproportionately impacted community, which is basically where mostly people of color live. All of a sudden, we had 64% who bought houses were for people of color, 75% were at 100% area median income and below, right? And it just goes to show what the power of money can do for people who make good decisions.
Well, we talked for 2 days and we still didn't cover everything, like alternatives to market-based solutions such as revisiting public housing, recently being referred to as social housing. If there was a big takeaway, it was a need to reframe housing as shelter and not just investment or commodity.
We got 11 million renters paying more than half their income on housing, and we think that we're going to fix zoning and make a little innovation in financing and solve this? No.
That's Chris Herbert, director of Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies.
We got to get enough housing for those 11 million people to be able to afford housing, and it's got to be outside the private market, because most of that increase in price is land prices. And so if we get that out of the market, and you have good housing that's well financed, over time we can actually start to have housing for those 11 million people. So we need to have this conversation. We need to have a name for it that doesn't make people think it's socialist or Swedish.
And with that, we'll let Chris Herbert have the last word. I hope you've enjoyed this romp through one of the most pressing and sometimes intractable problems of our day, affordable housing. Special thanks to TD Bank and the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard's Kennedy School. At the Lincoln Institute, follow us on X. The handle is @LandPolicy, and our website is lincolnins.edu. Please share, rate, and subscribe to Land Matters if you like what you hear. I'm your host, Anthony Flint. Bye for now.